History remembers the grand speeches, the battlefield victories, the moments when heroes step into the light and change everything with a single act of defiance. We remember the crossing of the Red Sea, the walls of Jericho tumbling down, David facing Goliath in the valley. These are the stories that capture our imagination. Dramatic, visible, undeniable miracles that leave no question about divine intervention. But some of the most profound turning points in human history happen in complete silence, in the middle of an ordinary night when a king cannot sleep, when a loyal man's name is whispered in a palace corridor, when faithfulness planted years earlier finally bears fruit in ways no one could have predicted. This is the story of such a moment. It unfolds in the sprawling Persian Empire during the reign of King Xerxes, in a time when the Jewish people lived as exiles scattered across 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia. It is the story of a man named Mordecai who sat at the king's gate day after day, watching, waiting, serving with quiet integrity. He did not seek glory. He did not demand recognition. He did not position himself for advancement or leverage his connections for personal gain. He simply remained faithful to his people, to his God, to the truth. And in doing so, he became part of a divine rescue that would unfold not through armies or miracles written in the sky, but through sleepless nights, carefully timed words, and the invisible hand of providence moving through the most ordinary circumstances. This is the story of Mordecai's vigil, not just a single night, but years of faithful presence, of integrity maintained when no one was watching, of courage sustained when the cost was high and the reward was invisible. It is the story of how God often works not through the spectacular but through the steady, not through the voices that shout but through the hearts that remain true, not through power displays that force compliance, but through quiet faithfulness that changes everything. This is the night that saved a nation, and the lifetime of preparation that made that night possible. Chapter 1: Exiles in a Foreign Empire. The Persian Empire was the superpower of the ancient world, a sprawling domain that encompassed everything from the Indus Valley to the shores of the Mediterranean, from the mountains of Armenia to the deserts of Egypt. It was a world of opulence and power unlike anything that had come before, where the royal palace in Susa gleamed with marble columns and golden fixtures, where the winter palace at Persepolis showcased the tribute of nations, where royal decrees could reshape entire populations with a stroke of the royal seal. King Xerxes, known in Persian as Kshayaksha, the great king of kings, ruled over this vast empire with absolute authority. His word was law. His decisions were final. His power seemed unlimited. And somewhere within this vast empire, scattered across its cities and provinces, living in communities from Babylon to Sardis, from Memphis to Ecbatana, lived the Jewish people, exiles whose ancestors had been carried away from Jerusalem generations earlier when the Babylonians conquered their homeland. It had been well over a century since the destruction of Solomon's temple, since the walls of Jerusalem were breached, since the leading citizens of Judah were marched into captivity. Many had returned to rebuild Jerusalem when the Persians allowed it under Cyrus and his successors, but many more had remained in the lands of their exile, building new lives in foreign soil. Most of the Jews living in Persia had never seen Jerusalem. They had been born in Persia, raised in Persia, built lives and businesses and families in Persia. They spoke Aramaic and Persian as fluently as Hebrew. They dressed in Persian style and participated in Persian commerce. Yet they carried within them the memory of who they were, a people chosen by the one true God, a people with a covenant stretching back to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, a people with promises yet to be fulfilled. They maintained their distinct identity even as they adapted to life in a foreign land. They kept the Sabbath, they observed the festivals, they taught their children the stories of their ancestors. They lived as strangers in a foreign land, never quite belonging, never quite assimilating, holding on to an identity that transcended geography. Among these exiles was a man named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a descendant of the tribe of Benjamin. His lineage connected him to the royal tribe from which King Saul had come, though those days of Jewish monarchy were long past. Mordecai held a position at the king's gate in Susa, not the physical gate of the city walls, but the administrative centre where official business was conducted, where legal matters were decided, where petitions were heard, where the daily machinery of imperial government turned. It was a position of some importance, requiring literacy, knowledge of law, discretion, and trustworthiness. Those who sat at the king's gate were officials who represented royal authority in day-to-day governance. The gate was more than just an administrative office. It was a place of visibility and vulnerability. Officials there were exposed to the comings and goings of court life, to the shifting winds of political fortune, to the intrigues and power plays that characterised life in any royal court. It required wisdom to navigate these waters successfully. You had to know when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act and when to wait, when to stand on principle and when to exercise diplomatic flexibility. Mordecai was faithful in his duties. He dressed in the simple robes of a court official. He carried out his responsibilities with diligence and competence. He spoke when necessary and remained silent when wisdom demanded it. He was not flashy or self-promoting, but neither was he invisible. He was known as reliable, honest, observant, qualities that would prove crucial in ways he could not yet imagine. But Mordecai carried something else with him, a deep commitment to his people and to the faith that defined them. When his uncle died, leaving behind an orphaned daughter named Hadassah, Mordecai had taken her in and raised her as his own. He had guided her with love and wisdom, teaching her the ways of their people, while also helping her navigate life in Persian society. The name Hadassah meant myrtle in Hebrew, but she was also known by her Persian name Esther, which may have derived from the Persian word for star, or possibly from the name of the Mesopotamian goddess Ishtar. This dual identity, Jewish in heritage, Persian in culture, would become significant in ways neither of them could have anticipated. When King Xerxes divorced his Queen Vashti for refusing to display herself at a royal banquet and ordered a kingdom-wide search for beautiful young women who might become the new queen, Esther was among those taken into the royal harem. It was not a choice. Beautiful young women throughout the empire were conscripted into this process, given a year of beauty treatments and preparation before being presented to the king. For a Jewish family, this was a complicated and difficult situation. Yet Mordecai advised Esther to conceal her Jewish identity during this process. It was not shame that motivated this secrecy, but prudence, an understanding that in a world of political intrigue and shifting power, wisdom sometimes required discretion. When Esther won the king's favour and became queen, crowned and celebrated throughout the empire, Mordecai did not seek special favour. He did not leverage his connection to the queen for personal gain. He did not request promotions or privileges. He continued his quiet service at the gate, watching over his adopted daughter from a distance, concerned for her welfare but respecting the boundaries of her new position. He walked by the courtyard of the harem regularly to learn how she was and what was happening to her, but always from a careful distance, never drawing attention to their relationship. He lived as so many faithful people have lived throughout history, doing what was right, day after day, without fanfare, without applause, without immediate reward, simply because it was right. He went to work. He fulfilled his duties. He kept his commitments. He maintained his integrity in small things, unaware that his faithfulness in the mundane details of daily life was preparing him for a crisis that would threaten the very existence of his people. Years passed this way. Esther adjusted to life as queen. Mordecai continued his service at the gate. The Jewish people throughout the empire continued their lives, working, worshipping, raising families, contributing to Persian society while maintaining their distinct identity. Everything seemed stable. Everything seemed ordinary. No one could see the storm that was gathering on the horizon, or the way that seemingly insignificant choices and relationships were being positioned like pieces on a game board, ready for a moment when everything would matter. Chapter 2. a rising threat. Power in the Persian court was a delicate and dangerous thing, constantly shifting, constantly being renegotiated. The king's favour could elevate a man to extraordinary heights or cast him down into oblivion. Nobles competed for position, for influence, for the king's attention. Alliances formed and dissolved. Rivalries simmered beneath the surface of courtly politeness. It was a world where perception mattered as much as reality, where maintaining honour and status required constant vigilance, where a single misstep or perceived insult could have devastating consequences. Into this world of carefully balanced authority and fragile egos came a man named Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite. The designation Agagite was significant to anyone who knew Jewish history. Agag had been the king of the Amalekites, the ancient enemies of Israel whom King Saul had been commanded to destroy completely, but had instead spared, an act of disobedience that cost Saul his kingdom. The Amalekites had been the first nation to attack Israel after the exodus from Egypt, striking at the weak and vulnerable stragglers at the rear of the column. God had declared perpetual war between Israel and Amalek because of this cruelty. So when Haman is identified as an Agagite, it signals to those who understand that this is not just a bureaucratic appointment, but the continuation of an ancient enmity. King Xerxes elevated Haman above all the other nobles, giving him a seat of honour higher than that of all the other officials. He was made second only to the king himself in authority and power. With this elevation came a decree, an order that reflected the Persian understanding of honour and hierarchy. All the royal officials at the king's gate were to kneel down and pay honour to Haman whenever he passed by. This was not merely a gesture of respect, but an act of submission, a public acknowledgement of Haman's elevated status, a daily ritual that would reinforce the power structure every time it was performed. Every day, as Haman passed through the gate in his splendid robes, officials would bow, they would bend the knee, they would lower their eyes and offer the gestures of submission that Persian protocol demanded. Every official, that is, except one. Mordecai remained standing. Day after day, while everyone around him knelt, Mordecai stood upright. He did not make a show of his refusal. He did not shout or draw attention to himself. He simply did not bow. The other officials at the gate noticed immediately. They questioned Mordecai. Why do you disobey the king's command? They asked him repeatedly, day after day, but he refused to comply. Finally, wanting to see whether Mordecai's behaviour would be tolerated, they told Haman about it. They reported that Mordecai had told them he was a Jew, as if this explanation somehow justified his refusal. It was not defiance for its own sake. It was not personal animosity toward Haman. It was not political rebellion against the king. For Mordecai, bowing to Haman would have meant offering a form of reverence that belonged to God alone. The Jewish people had been given clear instruction from the beginning. They were to worship no one but the Lord. "You shall have no other gods before me," the first commandment declared. "You shall not bow down to them or worship them." Throughout their history, this had been the defining boundary, the line that could not be crossed. Daniel's friends had refused to bow to Nebuchadnezzar's golden image and been thrown into a fiery furnace. Daniel himself had continued to pray to God despite a decree forbidding it, and been cast into a den of lions. For a faithful Jew, there were things more important than safety, more important than advancement, more important than life itself. So Mordecai stood, day after day, even as the tension mounted, even as the other officials questioned him, even as word reached Haman. He stood not because he was brave, but because he was faithful. He stood not because he wanted to make a statement, but because he could not in good conscience do otherwise. He stood because some lines cannot be crossed, even when crossing them would be easier, safer, more convenient. When Haman learned that Mordecai refused to kneel, his reaction was not measured or proportionate. He was not merely annoyed or disappointed. He was filled with rage, a consuming, overwhelming fury that distorted everything. Here was the second most powerful man in the empire, honoured by the king, elevated above all the other nobles, feared throughout the court, and yet this one Jewish official would not bow. The insult burned. The disrespect festered. The wound to Haman's pride went deep. But Haman was cunning as well as proud. He realized that punishing Mordecai alone would not satisfy his wounded ego or restore his sense of honor. If he had Mordecai executed, it would be a single punishment, over and done, quickly forgotten. But if Mordecai's refusal was rooted in his Jewish identity, if it was his Jewishness that made him unable to bow, then Haman could strike not just at the man but at his entire people. He could turn his personal grievance into a matter of state security. He could transform his wounded pride into genocide. It was a leap from personal offence to mass murder, but in the corridors of absolute power, such leaps happen more easily than we might imagine. Haman began to plan. He began to calculate. He began to gather information about the Jewish people scattered throughout the empire, their numbers, their locations, their customs, their vulnerabilities, and he began to lay the groundwork for what he intended to be the complete and total destruction of every Jewish man, woman and child in the Persian Empire. The danger was real. The threat was existential. And most of the Jewish people had no idea it was coming. They went about their daily lives, working in their trades, celebrating their festivals, raising their children, never imagining that in the royal court a plot was forming that would mark them all for death. Chapter 3. The Plot Against a People. Haman approached King Xerxes with a carefully crafted proposal. He was not foolish enough to mention Mordecai by name, or to make this about a personal grievance. That would have made it seem petty, vindictive, unworthy of the king's attention. Instead, he presented his plan in terms the king would understand, as a matter of imperial security, administrative efficiency, and even financial benefit to the royal treasury. The timing of this conversation is telling. It occurred in the first month of the 12th year of King Xerxes' reign, a specific date that would become significant. Haman cast lots, called Pur in Persian, to determine the most auspicious day for carrying out his plan. The lot fell on the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. This gave him nearly a full year to prepare, to ensure all the pieces were in place. Haman was methodical. He was patient. He was willing to wait for what he perceived as the perfect moment. There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, Haman said to the king, his voice measured and reasonable, the voice of a concerned adviser bringing a security matter to his sovereign's attention. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. It was a masterful manipulation. Every element of Haman's statement was designed to raise alarm in the king's mind. Dispersed among the peoples. This made the Jews sound like an infiltration, a group embedded throughout the empire rather than a legitimate minority population. Their customs are different. This played on the natural suspicion that any diverse empire has toward groups that maintain distinct identities. They do not obey the king's laws. This was the crucial accusation, framing the Jews as disloyal, as rebels, as a threat to imperial authority. None of it was true in any meaningful sense. Yes, the Jews maintained distinct customs, but so did many other ethnic and religious groups throughout the Persian Empire. Yes, they had their own laws and traditions, but they were generally law-abiding citizens who contributed to their communities and paid their taxes. The only disobedience Haman could point to was Mordecai's refusal to bow to him personally, hardly evidence of a widespread seditious conspiracy. But Haman did not need evidence. He only needed to plant the seed of suspicion in the mind of a king who ruled over a vast and diverse empire, a king who had reason to fear internal threats, a king who might be predisposed to believe that a distinct minority group could pose a danger. Then Haman sweetened his proposal with a financial incentive. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury. 10,000 talents of silver was an enormous sum, perhaps equivalent to 2/3 of the annual revenue of the entire Persian Empire. It was the kind of money that could fund military campaigns, build palaces, reward loyal provinces. Where did Haman plan to get such wealth? Presumably from the plunder of the Jewish people themselves. Their homes, their businesses, their accumulated wealth would be seized by those who killed them. Haman was essentially offering to turn genocide into a profit centre for the empire. King Xerxes, either persuaded by Haman's arguments or simply indifferent to the fate of a minority population, agreed. He took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman. This ring bore the royal seal, and its impression on a document gave that document the full force of imperial law. By giving the ring to Haman, the king was granting him complete authority to draft whatever decree he wished, and to issue it in the king's name. "Keep the money," the king said, apparently so unconcerned about the financial details that he waived Haman's offer, "and do with the people as you please." With those words, the fate of the Jewish people was placed entirely in Haman's hands, and Haman wasted no time. On the 13th day of the first month he summoned the royal secretaries. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. The orders were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with a simple, chilling command to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. The language was emphatic and redundant. Destroy, kill, annihilate. There was to be no ambiguity, no room for mercy or exception. Every Jewish person in the empire was to be killed on that specific day. The systematic nature of the plan was chilling. This was not a pogrom driven by mob violence, but a state-sponsored genocide, carefully organised, officially sanctioned, given the force of law. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so they would be ready for that day. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. And then, in a detail that reveals the casual cruelty of absolute power, we are told, "The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. The king and Haman celebrated. They had drinks. They relaxed, satisfied that a problem had been addressed, unconcerned about the human cost of their decision. But the city was bewildered, confused, troubled, uncertain what to make of this sudden decree condemning an entire people to death. Even those who had no particular love for the Jews, even those who stood to profit from their destruction, sensed that something was wrong, that a line had been crossed, that this was not normal governance but something darker. The edict was issued in the name of King Xerxes. It bore the royal seal. It had the full force of imperial law behind it. And once a Persian royal decree was issued, sealed with the king's ring, it could not be revoked. It was absolute, irrevocable, unchangeable. The machinery of death had been set in motion, and there seemed to be no way to stop it. Chapter 4. The Hidden Connection. When the news of the decree reached the Jewish communities scattered throughout the empire, the response was immediate and visceral. In every province, wherever the edict was published, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes, the traditional signs of grief and repentance, the outward expression of inner devastation. Mordecai learned of everything that had been done, not just the public edict, but the details of how it had come about, Haman's role in orchestrating it, the specific amount of money that had been discussed. As someone who worked at the king's gate, he had access to information and gossip that ordinary citizens would not hear. And when he understood the full scope of the threat, his response was profound and public. He tore his clothes, a sign of extreme grief in ancient Near Eastern culture, a visible demonstration that something devastating had occurred. He put on sackcloth, rough cloth typically worn during mourning, and covered himself with ashes. Then he went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. This was not quiet grief expressed in private. This was public lamentation, a cry of anguish that could not be contained, a protest against injustice that demanded to be heard. He went only as far as the king's gate because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter the gate area. But his positioning was deliberate. He placed himself where he knew he would be seen, where the news of his distress would reach the palace, where Esther's attendants would notice him and report back to the queen. Esther's attendants and eunuchs came and told her about Mordecai. The queen was in great distress. She did not yet understand what had happened or why Mordecai was in such a state. Her first response was practical. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, so he could come into the palace and explain the situation properly. But Mordecai refused the clothes. This was not about personal discomfort or appearance. This was about making sure Esther understood the gravity of the crisis, about ensuring she could not dismiss or minimize what was happening. Esther then called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been assigned to attend her. She ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why he was behaving this way. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him everything, not just that an edict had been issued, but the full story. How Haman had orchestrated it, the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews, the specific date that had been set. Mordecai also gave Hathach a copy of the text of the edict that had been published in Susa. He wanted Esther to see it with her own eyes, to read the actual words of the decree, to understand that this was not rumour or exaggeration but official imperial policy. And then Mordecai sent a message, a request that cut through all the layers of palace protocol and political calculation. He urged Esther to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. It was the moment when the hidden connection would matter. For years, Esther's Jewish identity had been kept secret. She had lived in the palace as the queen, participating in court life, representing the king at official functions, but never revealing her heritage. Only Mordecai and perhaps a few trusted servants knew that she was Jewish. She had built her life on discretion, on carefully maintained boundaries between her public role and her private identity. And now Mordecai was asking her to risk everything, to reveal who she was, to publicly identify with a people who'd been marked for destruction, to step into the line of fire. He was asking her to use her position as queen to intervene, to approach the king with a plea for mercy, to expose herself to danger for the sake of her people. Hathach returned to Esther and reported Mordecai's message, and Esther's initial response revealed the depth of her fear and the real danger involved in what Mordecai was asking. She sent instructions back to Mordecai through Hathach. All the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king. This was not just protocol or palace etiquette. This was Persian law, and the law was deadly serious. Approaching the king uninvited was a capital offence, punishable by immediate execution. The only exception was if the king extended his gold scepter toward the person, a gesture that indicated they were welcome and would be spared. But whether the king would extend the scepter was entirely at his discretion. There was no way to predict it, no way to ensure it. It depended entirely on the king's mood at that particular moment, and Esther added a significant detail. 30 days had passed since she'd been called to go to the king. For an entire month, the king had not summoned her. She had no way of knowing if she still held his favour, if he was growing tired of her, if another woman had caught his attention. Queens in the Persian court were not secure in their positions. They could be divorced, replaced, forgotten. Vashti had learned this when she refused the king's command and was immediately deposed. Esther had no guarantee that she would be received favourably if she approached uninvited. What Esther was essentially saying was, "I'm afraid. If I do what you're asking, I might die. And I don't even know if the king still cares about me. It's been a month since he called for me." It was honest. It was understandable. It was human. She was being asked to risk her life with no guarantee of success, at a time when she had no recent evidence of the king's favour. The fear was real. The danger was real. And Mordecai needed to respond in a way that both acknowledged the risk and helped Esther see why it was necessary to take it anyway. Chapter 5. The Risk of Approach. Mordecai's response to Esther's expression of fear is one of the most remarkable passages in the entire account. It combines challenge with hope, realism with faith, personal warning with theological conviction. He sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" There is so much packed into these few sentences. First, Mordecai addressed the natural human tendency to think we can remain safe by staying silent, by not taking sides, by keeping our heads down and hoping danger will pass us by. He told Esther directly, "Your position will not protect you. Your palace walls will not save you. If you remain silent and the decree goes forward, you will die too. Someone will eventually discover that you are Jewish, or Haman will learn of your identity, or in the chaos of the slaughter your heritage will be revealed. You cannot escape by doing nothing." But then Mordecai made a profound statement of faith. Relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. He did not say, "might arise," or "we hope will arise." He stated it as certainty. Deliverance will come. Somehow, some way, the Jewish people will be saved. This was not wishful thinking. This was faith rooted in the covenant promises of God, the belief that God would not abandon his people, that the story of Israel would not end in Persian genocide, that promises made to Abraham, Isaac and Jacob would not be nullified by Haman's plot. If Esther chose not to act, Mordecai believed God would raise up deliverance through some other means. But, and this was the warning, Esther and her father's family would perish. By remaining silent, she would miss her opportunity to be part of the rescue. She would forfeit the chance to fulfill the purpose for which she had been positioned, and she would not escape the consequences of the very thing she failed to prevent. Then came the question that has echoed through history. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this? It was an invitation to see her life from a larger perspective, to understand that her elevation to queen might not have been random or accidental, that there might be purpose and meaning in the timing of events. She had not sought to be queen. She had been taken into the royal harem along with many other young women. She had won the king's favour through qualities she could not fully control. She had been crowned at a specific moment in history, when Mordecai was at the gate, when Haman was being elevated to power, when a threat to the Jewish people was developing. Was all of this coincidence? Or was there a pattern, a purpose, a reason why she was exactly where she was at exactly this moment? Mordecai was not claiming to know God's specific plan. The phrase, "who knows," acknowledges the mystery and uncertainty inherent in trying to discern divine purpose. But he was suggesting that sometimes we are positioned in advance for moments of crisis, that our lives and choices might matter in ways larger than we can immediately see, that what looks like chance might be providence arranging the pieces for a moment when everything will depend on whether we have the courage to act. This is the question that faces everyone at some point. What if I'm here for a reason? What if my position, my relationships, my opportunities are not just about my own comfort or success, but about serving a purpose larger than myself? What if this uncomfortable, frightening moment is precisely what my life has been preparing me for? Esther had to choose. She could prioritize her safety, her position, her comfort, and possibly lose all of them anyway while also failing her people. Or she could embrace the risk, step into the unknown, trust that her position had meaning beyond her own life, and become part of something greater than herself. Her response showed the transformation that had occurred. "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do." When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." The decision was made, but notice what preceded the action. 3 days of fasting. This was not recklessness. This was not impulsive bravery. This was preparation. Before approaching the king, Esther wanted the entire Jewish community in Susa to fast with her. Fasting in the biblical tradition was a way of focusing on God, of expressing dependence, of seeking divine intervention. It was acknowledgement that success in this endeavour would not depend solely on her courage or persuasive ability, but on something beyond herself. "I and my attendants will fast as you do." She was joining herself to her people. She was no longer trying to maintain separate identities, no longer keeping her Jewish heritage hidden, at least not from her own community. She was claiming her identity, embracing her connection to the people who were under threat. "When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law." She was clear-eyed about what she was doing. She understood she was breaking the law. She knew the risk. She was not minimizing the danger or pretending it away. "And if I perish, I perish." This is the voice of someone who has moved beyond fear to acceptance. Not fatalism, not death wish, but the recognition that some things are worth risking death for, that there are moments when safety cannot be the highest priority, that courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Courage was born in preparation. Before the action came the fasting, before the risk came the resolve. Before stepping into the king's presence came 3 days of focusing on God, of building spiritual and emotional strength, of gathering the support of her community. And so the stage was set. The Jewish community fasted. Esther and her attendants fasted. They prepared themselves spiritually and emotionally for what was to come. And after 3 days, Esther would put on her royal robes and step into the inner court, where her fate would be decided in an instant. Would the king extend the golden scepter, or would he order her execution for approaching uninvited? Chapter 6. The Sleepless Night. On the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes. These were not just beautiful clothes, but symbols of authority and status, garments that reminded everyone who saw her that she was the queen. She was not approaching as a supplicant or a servant, but as the king's wife, though even that position offered no guarantee of safety. Then she went and stood in the inner court of the palace, in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won his favour. The text emphasises this. She found favour in his sight. This was not guaranteed. This could have gone differently. But in that moment, for reasons we cannot fully explain, the king looked at Esther and was favourably disposed toward her. He extended the gold scepter that was in his hand toward Esther. It was the signal of acceptance, the gesture that meant she would not die. She was invited to approach. She had survived the first hurdle. Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. This was the appropriate response, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement of the king's authority and mercy. The immediate danger had passed. She was alive. The king was willing to hear what she had to say. "What is it, Queen Esther?" the king asked. "What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be given you." This was standard royal hyperbole. Offering up to half the kingdom was a way of expressing generous willingness to grant a favour, not a literal offer to give away half the empire, but it indicated that the king was well disposed toward her, that he was ready to be generous, that her request would likely be granted. And yet Esther did not blurt out her request. She did not immediately reveal the plot or name Haman as the villain. Instead, she moved with careful strategy. "If it pleases the king, let the king, together with Haman, come today to a banquet I have prepared for him." It was an invitation to a private banquet, just the king, Esther, and Haman. The king agreed immediately, delighted by the personal attention. "Bring Haman at once," he ordered, "so that we may do what Esther asks." So the king and Haman went to the banquet Esther had prepared. At the banquet, as they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, Now what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted. Again, the opportunity was there. Again, she could have made her request. But again, she deferred. My petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favour, and if it pleases the king to grant my petition and fulfil my request, let the king and Haman come tomorrow to the banquet I will prepare for them. Then I will answer the king's question. A second delay. A second banquet requested. Why? The text doesn't explicitly tell us Esther's reasoning, but we can observe what the delay accomplished. It built suspense. It kept the king's curiosity engaged. It gave Haman time to overreach, to reveal more of his character. And perhaps most importantly, it allowed time for something else to happen, something that no one could have planned or predicted. Haman left the banquet that evening in high spirits. He was riding the absolute peak of his power and influence. The king had honoured him above all other nobles. The queen had invited him to an exclusive private banquet, and then invited him to another one the next day. He was at the centre of attention, singled out for honour, seemingly untouchable in his position of authority. He called his friends and his wife Zeresh to boast about his good fortune. He told them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honoured him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. Then he added, "And that's not all. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave, and she has invited me along with the king tomorrow." Everything was perfect. Everything was going his way. He was powerful, wealthy, honoured, and apparently beloved. But then his mood shifted dramatically. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. It is a stunning admission. Haman had everything most people would want. Wealth beyond measure, many sons, a sign of blessing in ancient culture, the king's favour, the queen's attention, a position of supreme authority. And yet all of it meant nothing because one man would not bow to him. One man's refusal to acknowledge his greatness poisoned every other success. This reveals the depth of Haman's pride and the emptiness at his core. No amount of honour would ever be enough. No achievement would ever satisfy. As long as one person refused to acknowledge his superiority, he could not be happy. His wife Zeresh and all his friends had a suggestion. Have a pole set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits, and ask the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. 50 cubits was approximately 75 feet, an enormous height, designed to make the execution visible throughout the city, a public demonstration of what happened to those who defied Haman. The suggestion delighted him. He had the pole set up immediately, eager for morning to come so he could request Mordecai's execution from the king and then go enjoy the queen's second banquet with his enemy finally destroyed. Everything was in place. Haman's plan seemed perfect. He would ask the king for Mordecai's death in the morning, attend the banquet in triumph, and watch his enemy be impaled on a pole tall enough for the entire city to see. Within hours, his last source of dissatisfaction would be eliminated. But that same night, something happened that would change everything, something that no one could have planned, predicted, or arranged through human effort alone. The king could not sleep. That's it. That's the detail on which everything would turn. King Xerxes on that particular night could not fall asleep. It was not illness. It was not noise or disturbance. It was not worry or anxiety that the text mentions. It was simply one of those nights when sleep would not come, when the mind stays alert despite the body's tiredness, when the hours stretch long and rest remains elusive. So the king ordered that the book of the Chronicles, the record of his reign, be brought in and read to him. Perhaps he hoped the dry recitation of official records would help him fall asleep. Perhaps he simply wanted distraction from his wakefulness. Court chronicles in the ancient world recorded significant events, honours bestowed, threats averted, official business conducted. They were detailed, thorough, and not particularly exciting to listen to. Perfect material for inducing sleep. And as the records were read aloud in the quiet of the night, As the king lay there listening to the accounting of his reign, the reader came upon an entry from several years earlier. It was an account of how Mordecai had discovered a conspiracy. Two of the king's officers, Bigthana and Teresh, who guarded the doorway, had become angry with the king and conspired to assassinate him. Mordecai had learned of the plot somehow, perhaps through his position at the gate, perhaps through connections who heard things, and he had reported it to Queen Esther, giving her the information. Esther had reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. The king had investigated, found the charges to be true, and had the two conspirators impaled on poles. The realm had been secured, the king's life had been saved. The king interrupted the reading. "What honour and recognition has Mordecai received for this?" he asked. His attendants checked the records. "Nothing has been done for him," they answered. Nothing. The man who had saved the king's life, who had exposed a conspiracy that would have resulted in the king's assassination, who had demonstrated extraordinary loyalty by reporting the plot rather than remaining silent or even joining it. This man had never been rewarded. The service had been noted in the official records but then forgotten. The debt had never been acknowledged. Justice had been delayed for years. It was a moment of clarity in the middle of a sleepless night, a realization that something was wrong, that an injustice had occurred through neglect, that a debt remained unpaid, that something needed to be set right. And the king's mind focused on this problem. How should Mordecai be honoured? What would be appropriate recognition for someone who had saved the king's life? And just then, just as this question was forming in the king's mind, just as dawn was breaking after the king's sleepless night, Haman entered the outer court of the palace. He had come early, eager to catch the king at the first opportunity, ready to request permission to impale Mordecai on the pole he had set up. He was full of anticipation, imagining the satisfaction of watching his enemy die, thinking about how he would enjoy the queen's banquet once this last irritation was eliminated. The timing was exquisite in its precision, the king wrestling with how to honour Mordecai and Haman arriving to request his execution. The king wondering what to do for the man who saved his life, and Haman eager to destroy that same man. Two purposes, diametrically opposed, converging at the exact same moment. Chapter 7. The Turning Point. The king's attendants announced that Haman was in the court waiting for an audience. "Bring him in," the king said. And when Haman entered, still full of confidence, still anticipating the request he was about to make, the king asked him a question. What should be done for the man the king delights to honour? Haman's heart must have soared. What else could the king be thinking of but honouring him? Who else had recently been singled out for the queen's exclusive attention? Who else was riding such a wave of royal favour? Surely the king wanted to honour him even further, to add yet another layer of recognition to his already elevated status. So Haman thought to himself, who is there that the king would rather honour than me? And he answered the king's question by describing a fantasy of public glory, an extravagant display that would announce his status to everyone in the city. For the man the king delights to honour, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honour, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honour." It was a ceremony that would blur the line between king and subject, temporarily elevating the honoured person almost to royal status, wearing the king's own robe, riding the king's own horse, being led through the streets by a noble prince while proclamations announced the king's delight in him. It was public coronation of honour, a spectacle that everyone would see and remember, an affirmation that would be talked about for years. Haman could already see it. He could imagine himself in the royal robe, sitting on the royal horse, hearing the proclamations echo through the streets, watching people bow and acknowledge his greatness. Even Mordecai would have to see it, would have to witness Haman's ultimate triumph, would have to acknowledge, just before being impaled, that Haman had won completely. Then the king spoke, and with 6 words, Haman's world collapsed. "Go at once. Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." The words hit Haman like a physical blow. Mordecai. The king wanted to honour Mordecai. Not Haman, but the very man Haman had come to destroy. Not his ally, but his enemy. Not the person who bowed, but the person who refused to bow. And the king was commanding Haman himself to perform this ceremony, to be the noble prince who would lead Mordecai through the streets, to proclaim his enemy's honour with his own voice. There was no escape. There was no way to refuse or deflect. The king had given a direct command using language that was emphatic. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. Every detail Haman had suggested in his moment of proud fantasy would now have to be carried out for the benefit of the man he most despised. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He found Mordecai at the king's gate, this man who had never bowed to him, who had frustrated his pride, who he had intended to execute within hours. And Haman, second only to the king in authority, had to dress Mordecai in the king's robe, help him onto the king's horse, and then lead him on foot through the city streets while proclaiming before him, over and over, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honour." Every step was agony. Every proclamation was humiliation. The reversal was complete. Haman had positioned himself above Mordecai, and now found himself literally beneath him, walking while Mordecai rode, announcing Mordecai's honour while his own pride was crushed. The man he had planned to impale was now being celebrated as a hero, and Haman himself was the unwilling instrument of his enemy's exaltation. The procession would have gone through the main streets, past the marketplace, through the areas where crowds would gather. Everyone would have seen it. Everyone would have heard Haman's proclamation. The news would spread quickly. The king was honouring Mordecai the Jew, and Haman himself was serving as his herald. Questions would be asked. Why was Mordecai being honoured? What had he done? The story of the assassination plot years earlier would be retold. Mordecai's loyalty would be praised, and Haman's status, his authority, his ability to command respect, all of it would be undermined by this very public role reversal. When the ceremony was finally over, Mordecai returned to the king's gate. He did not gloat. He did not celebrate. He simply resumed his position, his service, his quiet presence at the gate. He had not sought this honour. He had not asked for recognition. It had been given to him, and he accepted it with the same steady humility with which he had lived all along. But Haman rushed home, his head covered in grief, the traditional sign of mourning and shame. He told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened. The contrast with the previous evening could not have been more stark. The night before, he had been boasting about his wealth, his sons, his honours, his unique relationship with the queen. Now he was broken, humiliated, reporting his complete reversal of fortune. And his wife and advisers, who the previous night had encouraged him to build the pole and destroy Mordecai, now spoke words that must have felt like prophecy. Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin. They saw what Haman could not yet fully grasp, that forces beyond his control were at work, that his humiliation of that morning was not just a setback but the beginning of his complete destruction, that he had set in motion events that would now consume him. The very identity he had despised, Mordecai's Jewishness, was connected somehow to Haman's downfall. His advisers were essentially telling him that he had made a terrible mistake, that he was on the wrong side of something larger than palace politics, that his fate was now sealed. While they were still talking, while Haman was still reeling from the morning's events, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried him away to the banquet Esther had prepared. There was no time to recover, no opportunity to regroup or plan. He had to go directly from his humiliation to the queen's banquet, trying to compose himself, trying to understand what was happening, carrying with him the growing dread that his world was collapsing. The second banquet was about to begin. and Haman had no idea that the real blow was still to come. Chapter 8. Esther's Revelation. At the banquet, as they drank wine and the meal progressed, King Xerxes asked Esther the same question he had asked twice before. "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. And what is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted." "This time," Esther answered. The moment of revelation had arrived. Her voice was steady, but her words cut through the pleasant atmosphere of the banquet like a sword. "If I have found favour with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." The statement was devastating in its simplicity. The queen was asking for her life, not for wealth, not for honour, not for political advantage, but for the most basic thing, permission to continue living. And she was asking for her people, a people the king probably didn't even realise she belonged to be spared from destruction. The reference to being sold echoed Haman's offer to pay money into the treasury. Esther was making clear that this was not just an administrative decision, but a commercial transaction, a genocide offered up for profit, and her final comment, that if it had merely been slavery she would have remained silent, emphasised the absolute nature of the threat. Slavery would be terrible, but survivable. The destruction, killing, annihilation, these were final. These left no room for hope or recovery. King Xerxes responded with shock and anger. "Who is he? Where is he? The man who has dared to do such a thing?" Notice the king's reaction. He didn't immediately remember his own role in this. He didn't recall giving his signet ring to Haman or approving the edict. In his mind, this was something someone else had done, some villain who had dared to threaten the queen. It reveals how casually the king had agreed to Haman's plan, how little he had paid attention to the details, how disconnected he was from the consequences of his own decisions. Esther answered by pointing directly at the person reclining at the banquet. An adversary and enemy, this vile Haman. The accusation hung in the air. Haman, who had been invited to this exclusive banquet, who had been honoured by the queen's personal attention, who thought he was the favoured guest. He was being named as the villain, the enemy, the source of the threat. And suddenly everything made sense. The two banquets, the building suspense, the careful timing. Esther had not been honouring Haman. She had been setting him up for this moment of exposure. Terror seized Haman before the king and queen. He realised in an instant that everything was lost. His plot was exposed. His enemy was favoured by the king. His own life was now in danger. The queen he thought was honouring him was actually his accuser. All his plans, all his schemes, all his pride, it collapsed in that single moment. The king was so furious that he got up and went out into the palace garden. He was too enraged to remain in the room, too angry to trust himself to respond immediately. He needed space, needed to process what he had just learned. That his own decree, issued with his own seal, had threatened his own wife's life. Haman, seeing that the king had already decided his fate, seeing the fury in the king's exit, realised he had only moments to try to save himself. He threw himself on the couch where Esther was reclining, pleading for his life, begging for mercy from the very person he had planned to destroy. And just then, as the king returned from the garden, he saw Haman falling on the couch where the queen was reclining. In his rage, the king interpreted this in the worst possible way. Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house? It was almost certainly not what Haman was doing. He was pleading for mercy, not assaulting the queen. But in that moment, with the king's fury already at its peak, the visual of Haman on the queen's couch was enough to seal his fate. As soon as the words left the king's mouth, attendants covered Haman's face, the traditional gesture indicating that someone was condemned to death. Then one of the eunuchs, a man named Harbona, spoke up with information that would determine Haman's method of execution. A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He had it set up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The irony was perfect. The pole Haman had prepared for Mordecai, built to exactly the specifications Haman had wanted, tall enough to be visible throughout the city, designed to be the instrument of his enemy's destruction, that pole was available. And Harbona helpfully reminded the king that Mordecai was the one who had saved the king's life by exposing the assassination plot. The king's command was immediate and emphatic: impale him on it. So they took Haman and impaled him on the very pole he had prepared for Mordecai. The instrument of death he had designed for his enemy became the means of his own execution. The height he had chosen to make Mordecai's humiliation visible throughout the city now made his own death visible instead. Every detail of his plot, the pride that drove it, the pole that would execute it, the timing he had chosen, all of it collapsed back upon him. And with Haman's death, the king's fury subsided. Justice had been done, at least in the king's mind. The threat to the queen had been eliminated. The villain had been punished. But there was still one enormous problem that Haman's death did not solve. Chapter 9. Justice Reversed. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. It was substantial. Haman had been wealthy, with properties and possessions that now belonged to the queen. It was partial restitution, a transfer of the oppressor's wealth to one of his intended victims. Mordecai came into the presence of the king, for Esther had revealed how they were related. She explained that this was the man who had raised her, who had watched over her, who was like a father to her. The relationship that had been kept secret was now made known, and with that revelation came honour. The king took off his signet ring which he had reclaimed from Haman and presented it to Mordecai. This was the same ring that had sealed the decree of death. Now it was being given to the very man who had been targeted for execution. Mordecai was being elevated to the position Haman had held, second only to the king in authority. Esther appointed him over Haman's estate, so he was not only in possession of political power, but also of material resources. It was a complete reversal. The man marked for death was now in the highest position. The man who refused to bow was now honoured by the king. The intended victim inherited the oppressor's wealth and authority. Justice, in personal terms, had been served. But the original problem remained. Haman was dead, but his edict was still in effect. The decree calling for the destruction of all Jews on the 13th day of the 12th month had been issued under the king's seal, and Persian law was absolute. Once issued, a royal decree could not be revoked. It didn't matter that Haman was dead, that his plot had been exposed, that the king now regretted his decision. The law was the law, and the machinery of death was still in motion. Esther had to approach the king again. She fell at his feet and wept, begging him with tears to put an end to the evil plan of Haman the Agagite, to overturn the dispatches he had written to destroy the Jews throughout the king's provinces. The king extended the gold scepter to Esther, again granting her safety, again receiving her favourably, and she rose and stood before him. "If it pleases the king," she said, her voice carrying the weight of desperation, "and if he regards me with favour and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces, for how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family?" It was a plea that combined legal petition with personal anguish. She was asking for a legal solution to overrule the existing decree, but she was also expressing the emotional reality. How could she live knowing that her people would be destroyed? How could she continue as queen while her family, her community, her entire ethnic group was being annihilated? King Xerxes responded with a solution that acknowledged both the authority he'd given away and the limitations of his own power. Because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on the pole he set up. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring, for no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. The king was admitting the problem. The first decree couldn't be undone, but he was authorizing a second decree that could counter it. He was giving Mordecai and Esther full authority to draft whatever orders they thought necessary to protect the Jewish people, and he was giving them his signet ring to make those orders official and irrevocable. On the 23rd day of the third month, the month of Sivan, Mordecai summoned the royal secretaries. This was only 2 months and 10 days after the first decree had been issued. Time was of the essence, as the date for the destruction was still 9 months away. The secretaries wrote out all Mordecai's orders to the Jews and to the satraps, governors and nobles of the 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. The orders were written in the script of each province and the language of each people, and also to the Jews in their own script and language, making absolutely sure that everyone would understand what was being communicated. The new decree granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves. They were authorized to destroy, kill and annihilate the armed forces of any nationality or province that might attack them and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The language deliberately echoed the first decree. The same words Haman had used, destroy, kill, annihilate, were now being turned around, giving the Jews legal authorization to defend themselves against anyone who tried to carry out Haman's plan. This was to take effect on the same day chosen by Haman, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. So on that date, there would be 2 conflicting decrees in effect, one authorizing the destruction of the Jews, and one authorizing the Jews to defend themselves against anyone attempting to destroy them. The legal situation was complex, but the practical effect was clear. The Jews would not be defenseless victims. They would have the legal right and practical means to fight back. The dispatches were sent out by couriers on the king's fast horses, spurred on by the king's command. The speed was important. The message needed to reach every corner of the empire as quickly as possible, giving the Jewish communities time to prepare, giving potential attackers warning that the Jews were now legally protected and authorized to defend themselves. In Susa, the decree was published immediately, and Mordecai left the king's presence wearing royal garments of blue and white, a large crown of gold and a purple robe of fine linen. The description emphasizes his elevation. These were not his usual official robes, but garments that marked him as someone of extraordinary status and authority. He was being honored publicly, visibly, in a way that everyone could see. The city of Susa held a joyous celebration. This is a striking detail. Not just the Jews, but the entire city celebrated. The earlier bewilderment when Haman's decree was issued had given way to relief and celebration when justice was restored. The citizens of Susa recognized that something right had been done, that a terrible wrong had been corrected. For the Jews throughout the empire, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. The emotional language piles up. Happiness, joy, gladness, honor, trying to capture the overwhelming relief and celebration that swept through Jewish communities as the news reached them. They had been facing certain death. Now they had legal protection and the right to defend themselves. The reversal was complete. In every province and in every city where the edict of the king reached, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating, and many people of other nationalities became Jews, either converting genuinely or claiming Jewish identity for protection, because fear of the Jews had seized them. This last detail is significant. The reversal was so complete, the shift in power dynamics so dramatic, that people were actually afraid of the Jews now. The group that had been marked for destruction was now seen as powerful and dangerous. Whether this was a good thing or simply a pragmatic response to changed circumstances, it represented a total transformation of the Jewish people's status in the empire. Chapter 10. A Nation Preserved. The 13th day of Adar arrived, the day that had been chosen by Haman through the casting of lots, the day that was supposed to mark the destruction of the Jewish people throughout the Persian Empire. But when that day came, The tables had been completely turned. Instead of being victims, the Jews were defenders. Instead of being destroyed, they struck down their enemies. On that day, the Jews assembled in their cities in all the provinces of King Xerxes to attack those who were seeking their ruin. No one could stand against them, because the people of all the other nationalities were afraid of them. This fear was not just fear of the Jews themselves, but fear of what they represented. The favour of the king, the protection of the queen, the authority of Mordecai, who now held the second highest position in the empire. All the nobles of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and the king's administrators helped the Jews, because fear of Mordecai had seized them. Mordecai had become prominent in the palace. His reputation spread throughout the provinces, and he became more and more powerful. The officials who were supposed to maintain order and enforce the king's decrees were now actively helping the Jews defend themselves, because they understood that opposing the Jews meant opposing Mordecai, and opposing Mordecai meant opposing someone with direct access to the king's authority. The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and they did what they pleased to those who hated them. The language emphasizes the Jews' agency and power. They did what they pleased. They were not constrained or limited. Those who had planned to attack them and plunder their goods found themselves on the receiving end of violence instead. In the citadel of Susa, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men. They also killed the 10 sons of Haman, Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Visatha. The text carefully lists all their names, marking their deaths as the final elimination of Haman's line and legacy. But then comes an important detail. But they did not lay their hands on the plunder. This is repeated multiple times in the account. The Jews killed their enemies but did not take their possessions. This was significant because the second decree had authorized them to plunder the property of their enemies, just as Haman's original decree had authorized the destruction of the Jews and the plundering of their goods. But the Jews chose not to exercise this right. They were defending themselves, eliminating the threat, but not enriching themselves through their enemies' deaths. It was a statement that this was about survival and justice, not about greed or opportunism. When the king learned that 500 men had been killed in Susa, along with Haman's 10 sons, he asked Esther what else she wanted. The Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and the 10 sons of Haman in the citadel of Susa. What have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? It will also be granted. Esther made 2 requests. First, she asked for the Jews in Susa to be given permission to carry out tomorrow's edict today as well, essentially extending the period of authorized self-defense for one more day in the capital city. Second, she asked that the bodies of Haman's 10 sons be impaled on poles, displayed publicly as a warning and a symbol of complete defeat. Both requests were granted. So on the 14th day of the month of Adar, the Jews in Susa came together again and killed 300 more men in Susa. Again, they did not lay their hands on the plunder. Meanwhile, the other Jews in the provinces assembled to protect themselves and got relief from their enemies. They killed 75,000 who hated them but did not lay their hands on the plunder. The numbers are striking. 75,000 killed throughout the provinces. This was not a small skirmish but a substantial conflict, indicating that many people throughout the empire had been prepared to attack the Jews when Haman's decree took effect. The threat had been real. The danger had been widespread. Without the second decree authorizing self-defense, the slaughter would have gone in the other direction. This all happened on the 13th day of Adar. On the 14th, the Jews rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. The Jews in Susa, however, had assembled on both the 13th and 14th, and then on the 15th they rested and made it a day of feasting and joy. This created 2 slightly different traditions, Jews in rural areas celebrating on the 14th of Adar, and Jews in Susa and later other walled cities celebrating on the 15th. Mordecai recorded these events carefully. He was not just a participant but a chronicler, someone who understood the importance of preserving the memory of what had happened. He sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes near and far, establishing that they should celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of Adar as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy and their mourning into a day of celebration. The Jews agreed to continue the practice they had begun, taking on themselves and their descendants and all who joined them the obligation to observe these 2 days without fail, according to the written instructions and at the designated time every year. These days were to be remembered and observed in every generation by every family, in every province and in every city. These days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated among the Jews, and the memory of these days should never perish among their descendants. The celebration was called Purim, from the Persian word pur, meaning lot, because Haman had cast lots to determine the date for the Jews' destruction. The very mechanism Haman had used to choose the timing of genocide, leaving it to chance to the casting of lots, became the name for the festival celebrating the reversal of his plot. What was meant to be random and arbitrary became instead the name for a holiday celebrating divine providence, working through seemingly ordinary events. Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew wrote with full authority to confirm this second letter concerning Purim, establishing these days of Purim at their designated times, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had decreed for them, and as they had established for themselves and their descendants in regard to their times of fasting and lamentation. Esther's decree confirmed these regulations about Purim, and it was written down in the records. The story ends with administrative details, the establishment of an annual celebration, the recording of events, the securing of memory for future generations. But underneath these practical details is a profound recognition. This was not just a lucky escape or a fortunate turn of events. This was something worth remembering, worth celebrating, worth passing down to children and grandchildren. This was a moment when everything could have gone wrong, but instead went right, when destruction was turned into deliverance, when mourning became dancing. Epilogue. Providence in the shadows. King Xerxes imposed tribute throughout the empire to its distant shores, and the empire continued its normal functioning. The crisis had passed. Life went on. And all the acts of King Xerxes' power and might, together with a full account of the greatness of Mordecai to whom the king had promoted him, are they not written in the book of the annals of the kings of Media and Persia? Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Xerxes, preeminent among the Jews, and held in high esteem by his many fellow Jews because he worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. It is a quiet ending to such a dramatic story. There are no supernatural fireworks, no angels appearing with flaming swords, no miraculous plagues striking down enemies. The account ends with administrative notes about tribute and historical records, with Mordecai continuing his work in the Persian government, using his position to benefit his people. It seems almost anticlimactic after all the drama that preceded it. But that quiet ending is precisely the point. This is a story about how God works not through spectacular miracles, but through ordinary circumstances orchestrated with extraordinary precision. It's about faithfulness maintained in the mundane realities of daily life, about courage found in unexpected people at crucial moments, about the way that choices made years earlier create the conditions for deliverance in the present. Consider all the pieces that had to be in place for this rescue to occur. Esther had to become queen, chosen from among many candidates, winning the king's favour at just the right time. This happened years before Haman was elevated to power, years before the threat to the Jewish people emerged. Yet when the crisis came, there was someone in the royal palace who was both Jewish and had the king's ear. Mordecai had to be positioned at the king's gate, faithful in his duties, observant enough to notice a conspiracy, loyal enough to report it. This happened years before it would matter, before anyone knew that this act of loyalty would become the hinge on which everything would turn. The king's sleepless night had to occur on exactly the right night, after Haman had set up the poll and was planning to request Mordecai's execution, but before he actually made that request. One night earlier or later, and everything would have unfolded differently. The passage read from the Chronicles during that sleepless night had to be the one about Mordecai saving the king's life. The court records were extensive, covering years of events, but that particular night, the reader came to that particular passage, reminding the king of a debt never paid. Haman had to arrive at the palace just when the king was wondering how to honour Mordecai. His timing, meant to be opportune for requesting his enemy's death, instead became the mechanism for his enemy's exaltation. Esther had to win the king's favour again when she approached uninvited, survive the initial risk, and then navigate the complex task of exposing Haman without seeming to criticise the king who had approved Haman's plan. None of these individually is impossible or even particularly unlikely. Kings do have sleepless nights. Court records do get read. Officials do expose conspiracies. Queens do approach their husbands with requests. But all of them together, timed precisely, arranged perfectly, each piece fitting into the larger pattern, that begins to look less like coincidence and more like careful orchestration. And yet God's name is never mentioned in the entire account, not once. The Book of Esther is unique in biblical literature for this omission. There are no prayers recorded, no prophets delivering messages, no miraculous interventions that force acknowledgement of divine presence. Everything happens through human choices and natural circumstances. You could read the story and conclude it was simply good luck, clever strategy, and fortunate timing. But the Jewish people who celebrate Purim every year understand it differently. They see in the story a pattern of providence working quietly behind the scenes, arranging circumstances, positioning people, timing events with precision, while allowing human beings to make real choices with real consequences. This is not determinism that removes human agency, but rather divine sovereignty working through human faithfulness, turning choices made in ordinary days into pivotal moments that change history. Mordecai's vigil was not a single night, but a lifetime. It was years of showing up at the king's gate, performing his duties faithfully even when no one noticed. It was the choice to report the assassination plot when remaining silent would have been safer. It was the refusal to bow to Haman even when everyone around him was bowing, even when maintaining that principle cost him personally. It was the courage to challenge Esther, to help her see her moment of destiny, to believe that deliverance would come even if she chose not to be part of it, and Esther's courage was born in preparation. 3 days of fasting before approaching the king, community support surrounding her, spiritual and emotional strengthening before stepping into danger. Her courage was also born in wisdom, the careful timing of her revelations, the building of suspense, the strategic use of banquets to create the right context for her accusation. She was not reckless but thoughtful, not impulsive but prepared. The lesson is profound and applicable across time and culture. God often works through unseen faithfulness rather than public heroics. He positions people in advance, sometimes years before they're needed. He prepares hearts through consistent obedience in small things. He turns sleepless nights into moments of revelation. He takes plots meant for destruction and transforms them into platforms for deliverance. You may be living your own vigil right now, showing up day after day at your equivalent of the king's gate, doing what is right even when no one notices, serving faithfully in ordinary circumstances that seem to have no particular significance. You may be maintaining integrity in small decisions, standing firm on principles that cost you personally, preparing yourself spiritually and emotionally for challenges you can't yet see coming. You may wonder if it matters. You may question whether your faithfulness makes any difference in a world that often rewards compromise and celebrates those who make noise over those who remain steady. You may feel invisible, unrecognized, stuck in ordinary routines while others seem to be doing dramatic and important things. But Mordecai's story whispers a different truth. Your quiet faithfulness is seen. Your integrity matters. Your daily choices are creating conditions for moments of impact you cannot yet imagine. The courage you develop now in small things is preparing you for larger challenges ahead. The relationships you're building, the reputation you're earning, the spiritual disciplines you're maintaining, all of it may be positioning you for a moment when everything will depend on whether you're ready. Providence often works in shadows. It moves through ordinary moments that only later reveal their significance. It positions people long before crisis arrives. It transforms intended destruction into unexpected deliverance. And years later, looking back, the pattern becomes clear. Not luck, not coincidence, but the careful orchestration of a God who never abandons his people, even when his name goes unspoken, even when his presence feels invisible. Rest in that truth, trust in that reality. Continue your vigil with faithfulness, knowing that ordinary obedience often matters more than extraordinary gestures, that daily integrity builds the foundation for moments of courage, that God is working through your life in ways you may not see until much later. The story of Purim is still celebrated by Jewish communities around the world, thousands of years after these events occurred. Children dress up in costumes, families gather for festive meals. The Book of Esther is read aloud, with the congregation making noise whenever Haman's name is mentioned and cheering when Mordecai and Esther are named. It is a celebration of reversal, of deliverance, of the defeat of those who seek to destroy God's people. But it is also a reminder that faithfulness in ordinary days creates the conditions for extraordinary outcomes, that courage is often quiet before it becomes visible, that God's purposes unfold in ways we cannot always see in the moment, but become undeniable when viewed from the perspective of time. Mordecai's legacy is captured in the final description. He worked for the good of his people and spoke up for the welfare of all the Jews. Not that he achieved great fame, not that he accumulated wealth or power for himself, not that he took revenge on all his enemies. His legacy was simpler and more profound. He used his position to benefit others. He advocated for the vulnerable. He served the common good of his community. May we all leave such a legacy, not of power grasped for ourselves, but of faithfulness sustained for others, not of glory claimed in our own names, but of God's purposes fulfilled through lives lived with quiet, unshakable courage, not of dramatic gestures that fade from memory, but of steady service that shapes history in ways we may never fully know. The night that saved a nation was actually thousands of ordinary days of faithfulness that created the conditions for that night to matter. The vigil that made deliverance possible was not a moment but a lifestyle, not an event but a character formed over years of choosing integrity over convenience, truth over comfort, faithfulness over safety. And that is the invitation extended to us, to live our vigils faithfully, trusting that God is positioning us even when we cannot see the purpose, preparing us even when we don't understand the plan, orchestrating circumstances even when everything seems ordinary or even discouraging. For such a time as this, that phrase has become famous, a call to recognize moments of destiny. But the profound truth is that every time is such a time. Every ordinary day is preparing us for extraordinary moments. Every small choice is building the foundation for larger impacts. Live faithfully in the ordinary. Stand firm on principle even when it costs you. Maintain integrity in small things. Prepare yourself spiritually and emotionally. Build relationships with care. Serve your community faithfully. And trust that God is weaving all of it together into something far more significant than you can see in the moment. That is the lesson of Mordecai's vigil. That is the wisdom of Esther's courage. That is the testimony of a night that saved a nation because faithful people were ready when the moment came. May we all be ready for our moments. May we all maintain our vigils with faithfulness. And may we all trust that in the shadows where we cannot see, Providence is at work, arranging circumstances, positioning people, preparing deliverance for such a time as this. the kingdom of Judah approximately 850 years before the Common Era. A small nation carved into the hills and valleys of the ancient Near East, surrounded by hostile powers, trade routes, and the endless political machinations of empires. This was not a time of peace. This was not an era when small kingdoms survived by accident. Survival required cunning, strength, military prowess, and often brutal compromise. But Judah had something different. They had Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat was not like the kings who came before him, nor like those who would come after. He ascended to the throne as a young man, inheriting a kingdom still recovering from the spiritual chaos of previous generations. His father Asa had begun reforms, tearing down pagan altars and driving out those who practiced divination and idol worship. But Jehoshaphat took it further, much further. He understood something fundamental. A kingdom's strength was not measured only in chariots and fortified cities, but in the spiritual foundation of its people. So he did something almost unheard of in the ancient world. He sent teachers throughout the land, not tax collectors, not military recruiters, teachers. These men carried scrolls containing the law, the ancient instructions given to Moses centuries before. They travelled from town to town, village to village, gathering people in the squares and teaching them. They explained the commandments, the festivals, the stories of deliverance. They reminded the people of who they were and whose they were. Jehoshaphat strengthened the cities. He built fortifications, yes, but he also established garrisons not just for defence but to maintain order and justice. He appointed judges throughout Judah, instructing them with words that would echo through history. Consider carefully what you do, because you are not judging for man but for the Lord, who is with you whenever you give a verdict. Now let the fear of the Lord be upon you. Judge carefully, for with the Lord our God there is no injustice or partiality or bribery. This was revolutionary. In a world where justice could be bought, where the powerful crushed the weak without consequence, Jehoshaphat was building something different. A kingdom where the law applied to everyone, where the wealthy could not simply purchase favourable outcomes, where the orphan and widow had the same standing as the merchant and landowner. The kingdom prospered. Trade routes brought wealth. The people experienced a season of peace. Surrounding nations, seeing Judah's growing strength and stability, thought twice before provoking conflict. Some even brought gifts and tribute, preferring alliance to warfare. Jehoshaphat expanded his influence through strategic marriages and alliances. He maintained a standing army, well-trained and well-equipped. Chronicles from that period record that he had commanders and troops numbering in the hundreds of thousands. Soldiers who trained regularly, who understood formation and discipline, who were loyal to their king and their God. For years this was enough. Judah thrived. The people worshipped freely. The harvests were good. Children grew up hearing the old stories, learning the ancient songs, understanding their identity as a chosen people with a unique covenant. But peace, as it always does in this broken world, eventually gave way to storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Chapter 2. The threat emerges. The messenger arrived at dawn, his horse lathered with sweat, his face grey with exhaustion and fear. He had ridden through the night from the eastern watchtowers, changing horses at every garrison, pushing himself and his mounts to the breaking point. Because the news he carried could not wait, could not be delayed even by an hour. He was brought immediately before the king. "My lord," he said, barely able to catch his breath, "an army is coming, a vast army, from beyond the Dead Sea, from Edom. They have already crossed into our territory. They are at En-Gedi." The room fell silent. En-Gedi. That was barely a 3-day march from Jerusalem. This was not a border skirmish. This was not a raiding party. This was an invasion force, and it was already well inside Judah's borders. "Who?" Jehoshaphat demanded. "Who marches against us?" "The Moabites, my lord, and the Ammonites, and with them, others, people from Mount Seir, the numbers." The messenger paused, struggling to find words for what he had seen. "My lord, I have never seen so many. They fill the valleys like locusts. Their campfires at night look like a city made of stars. They are more than we can count." The king's advisors immediately began speaking over one another. Some called for immediate military mobilization. Others suggested sending envoys to negotiate to buy time. A few mentioned calling on allies, though everyone in the room knew Judah's alliances were political conveniences, not promises written in blood. When the moment of crisis came, they would be alone. Jehoshaphat raised his hand, silencing the room. He stood, walking to the window that overlooked Jerusalem. The city was just beginning to wake. Smoke rose from morning cooking fires. Merchants were setting up their stalls in the markets. Children played in the streets. Normal life continuing in blissful ignorance of the doom marching toward them. The situation was dire. Moab and Ammon were ancient enemies of Israel and Judah, descendants of Lot who had always harboured resentment toward their relatives who had inherited the promised land. They were fierce warriors, familiar with the desert terrain, masters of ambush and guerrilla warfare. But this was not just those two nations. The coalition included others, expanding the threat exponentially, and they had done something tactically brilliant. They had approached from the east, from the wilderness side where Judah's defences were weakest. The major fortifications faced north and west, toward the traditional threats of Aram and the coastal peoples. The eastern approach, through the rugged terrain near the Dead Sea, had always been considered too difficult for a major military operation. Apparently the enemy had decided the difficulty was worth the element of surprise. Jehoshaphat's commanders began calculating scenarios. Even with rapid mobilization, they could muster perhaps 50,000 fighting men. Disciplined? Yes. Well-trained? Certainly. But against a force that might number 3 or 4 times that size. The mathematics of warfare were brutally simple. Without a significant tactical advantage, without defensible terrain, without time to prepare proper fortifications, they would be overwhelmed. Some of the younger commanders spoke boldly of Gideon, of how God had given victory to 300 men against thousands. But the older veterans remained silent. They had seen battle. They knew what happened when infantry formations broke. They knew how quickly courage could turn to panic when the line collapsed and enemy soldiers poured through the gaps. The king turned from the window. His face was set, determined, but those closest to him could see something else in his eyes. Not panic exactly, not despair, but a deep, profound recognition of how precarious their situation had become. "Send word to every town and city," he said quietly. "We're calling a fast, the entire nation. Tomorrow, everyone who can travel is to come to Jerusalem. We're going to seek the Lord." Some of the advisors exchanged glances. A fast? Now? With an enemy army days away? Shouldn't they be marshalling troops, preparing defences, forging last-minute alliances? But Jehoshaphat was not asking for opinions. This was not a suggestion. This was a royal decree. Because he understood something his advisors were too practical to see. Some battles cannot be won with swords alone. Some enemies are too powerful for human strength to overcome, and in those moments you either trust in something greater than yourself, or you are crushed beneath the weight of impossible odds. Messengers were dispatched immediately. Riders left Jerusalem in every direction, carrying the king's summons, a fast, a holy assembly, tomorrow. The city began to transform almost immediately. Word spread through the markets, through the neighbourhoods, through the surrounding villages. An army was coming. The king had called for prayer. Families began preparing to travel to Jerusalem. Those already in the city began preparing the squares and courtyards for the multitudes who would arrive. As the sun set that evening, Jehoshaphat stood again at his window. Somewhere to the east, beyond the hills, an enemy force was making camp, confident in their numbers, sharpening their weapons, preparing for the slaughter they anticipated. And in Jerusalem, the people of Judah were preparing something entirely different. Chapter 3. The National Fast. They came on foot, on donkeys, in carts. They came from the northern villages near Bethel and from the southern settlements near Beersheba. They came from the fortified cities and from tiny farming communities that barely appeared on any map. They came as families, as clans, as entire townships moving together along the ancient roads. By midday, Jerusalem was overflowing. The courtyards around the temple filled first, then the adjacent squares, then the streets themselves. People stood shoulder to shoulder, young and old, wealthy and poor, priests and farmers. The normal social hierarchies that structured ancient society seemed to dissolve in the face of shared danger. Parents held children in their arms, explaining in hushed voices what was happening. Elderly men and women who remembered previous wars, previous invasions, sat with sombre faces, knowing too well what an overwhelming enemy force could do to a conquered people. Young men, who days before might have boasted about their courage and readiness to fight, now stood quiet, the reality of facing a vastly superior force settling heavily on their shoulders. No cooking fires were lit, no meals were prepared. This was a fast, a complete cessation of normal life. Even the markets remained closed. The usual sounds of commerce, of daily activity, were replaced by something else, the sound of prayer. It started quietly, individuals and families praying in small groups, but gradually, like tributaries joining into a river, the prayers began to merge. Voices joined together, ancient psalms were recited, songs of deliverance from generations past were sung, the melodies carrying through the streets, a collective cry rising toward heaven. The temple priests moved through the crowds, offering guidance, leading prayers, reminding people of the covenant, of God's past faithfulness. They recounted the great deliverances, the exodus from Egypt, the crossing of the Red Sea, the fall of Jericho, the victory of David over Goliath. Each story was not just history but a reminder, a testimony that the God they served had done impossible things before, but there was also raw honesty in the prayers. People were afraid, mothers wept, thinking of what invading armies did to children. Men confessed their doubts, their fear that this time might be different, that this enemy might be too strong. The prayers were not performances. They were the desperate cries of people who knew they were powerless, who had nowhere else to turn. As evening approached, the crowd grew even larger. Those who lived farther away had been travelling since dawn, and they continued arriving throughout the day. The gates of Jerusalem remained open, welcoming everyone. Guards who normally checked credentials and collected tolls simply waved people through. This was not a time for bureaucracy. This was national crisis and everyone was needed. Jehoshaphat had not yet appeared publicly. He remained in the palace, in his private chambers, spending the day in his own prayers and contemplation. His advisors came periodically with updates, reports from scouts about the enemy's movements, estimates of their arrival time, suggestions for military deployment. But the king's focus was elsewhere. He had made his decision about how to face this threat, and it was not primarily a military decision. Yes, the army would be prepared. Yes, defences would be set. But the real battle, the one that would determine whether Judah survived or perished, would not be fought with bronze and iron. As darkness fell over Jerusalem, torches and lamps were lit throughout the city. The glow could be seen for miles, a city ablaze with light, filled with people who had set aside everything to seek divine intervention. The prayers continued into the night, not with the formal structure of liturgy, but with the raw desperation of people who had nowhere else to go. In the eastern wilderness, the coalition army also made camp for the night. Their scouts had reported that Judah's forces were not deploying to meet them in the field. Instead, the entire population seemed to be gathering in Jerusalem. The enemy commanders laughed at this. Retreating to the city? That just made the conquest easier. They would surround Jerusalem, cut off supplies, and wait. A siege might take weeks or months, but the outcome was inevitable. Judah would surrender or starve. But what the enemy commanders could not understand, was that Judah was not preparing for a siege. They were preparing for something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with military strategy or defensive fortifications, something that would make the next day one of the most remarkable in the history of warfare. Chapter 4. The Prayer in the Temple. Dawn broke over Jerusalem to find the crowds had not dispersed. Many had spent the entire night in prayer, sustained not by food, but by collective urgency. As the sun rose, the priest opened the inner courts of the temple, and the people pressed forward, filling every available space. Then Jehoshaphat appeared. He emerged from the palace wearing not royal regalia, not the ceremonial robes of kingship, but simple garments. He walked through the crowds, acknowledging no one, his eyes fixed ahead on the temple. The people parted to let him through, and a hush fell over the massive assembly. He entered the temple courts and positioned himself before the altar, in the place where priests typically stood to offer sacrifices. But he carried no sacrifice. He brought no offering of grain or livestock. He brought only himself and his words. The crowd pressed close, straining to hear. Those who could not fit in the temple courts filled the surrounding areas, and word of what the king said would be passed back through the crowds, repeated from person to person, until even those at the farthest edges knew what their king was praying. Jehoshaphat raised his hands toward heaven and began to speak. "Lord, the God of our ancestors, are you not the God who is in heaven? You rule over all the kingdoms of the nations. Power and might are in your hand, and no one can withstand you." His voice was strong but not arrogant, confident but not presumptuous. He was stating facts, reminding himself and his people of foundational truth. The God they served was not a local deity, not a tribal protector with limited range and power. This was the creator of heaven and earth, the one who had brought their ancestors out of slavery in Egypt, who had given them this land. Our God, did you not drive out the inhabitants of this land before your people Israel, and give it forever to the descendants of Abraham your friend? They have lived in it, and have built in it a sanctuary for your name. He was recounting history, but it was not dry recitation. It was personal. Abraham your friend. Not Abraham the patriarch, not Abraham the founder of the nation, but Abraham your friend. Reminding God and himself and everyone listening that their relationship with the divine was not transactional, but relational. Built on covenant, built on promises made and kept. If calamity comes upon us, whether the sword of judgment or plague or famine, we will stand in your presence before this temple that bears your name and will cry out to you in our distress, and you will hear us and save us. Now he was moving to the present crisis, building his case. This is what you promised. This is the covenant. We cry out, you save us. This is how it works. This is what we are doing now. His voice grew more intense, more urgent. But now here are men from Ammon, Moab and Mount Seir, whose territory you would not allow Israel to invade when they came from Egypt. So they turned away from them and did not destroy them. See how they are repaying us by coming to drive us out of the possession you gave us as an inheritance. There was anger in his voice now, righteous indignation. We obeyed you. When our ancestors could have conquered these peoples, we held back because you told us to. We showed mercy, and now they repay that mercy with invasion. With attempted genocide, the crowd murmured in agreement. Yes, this was unjust. This was wrong. They had honoured God's commands even when it seemed militarily foolish to leave potential enemies unconquered on their borders, and this was how they were repaid. Then Jehoshaphat's voice changed. The anger faded, replaced by something else. Vulnerability, honesty. The raw admission that every person in that crowd was feeling, but most were too proud to say out loud. Our God, will you not judge them? For we have no power to face this vast army that is attacking us. We have no power. 4 words that no king wanted to speak. 4 words that admitted weakness, that confessed inadequacy, that laid bare the truth everyone knew, but no one wanted to acknowledge. We have no power. The trained army, insufficient. The fortifications, inadequate. The strategic position, untenable. The military advisors, with all their experience and tactical knowledge, out of solutions. We have no power. But Jehoshaphat was not finished, because admitting powerlessness was not the same as admitting defeat. Confessing human limitation was not the same as accepting destruction. There was one more sentence, one more phrase that would transform everything. "We do not know what to do." A pause. The crowd held its breath. "But our eyes are on you." Silence. Absolute silence. Thousands of people and not a sound. Even the children seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. "Our eyes are on you, not on our army, not on our walls, not on our strategy or our weapons or our desperate last-minute plans. Our eyes are on you." Jehoshaphat lowered his hands. He stood there, before the altar, before the assembled nation, having laid out the situation with brutal honesty, having confessed their complete inability to save themselves, having placed everything, the survival of the nation, the lives of every person in that crowd, in the hands of the God they served. All of Judah stood before the Lord with their wives and children and little ones. They waited, because now it was not their turn to act. They had done what they could do. They had fasted. They had prayed. They had confessed. They had trusted. Now they waited to see if trust would be enough. Chapter 5. The prophetic response. The silence stretched. 1 minute. 2. 5. People shifted uncomfortably, wondering what would happen next. Some expected the king to continue speaking. Others thought perhaps the high priest would offer additional prayers. But no one spoke. The assembly remained in expectant stillness. Then something unexpected happened. From somewhere in the midst of the crowd, a man began to move forward. His name was Jahaziel, a Levite, a temple musician, a member of the family of Asaph. He was not high-ranking, not a priest, not a political figure, just a worship leader, someone who on a normal day would have been in the background, supporting the formal religious ceremonies. But something had come upon him. The Spirit of the Lord, the ancient texts would later record. He pushed through the crowd, not rudely, but with unmistakable urgency, making his way toward where the king stood. People recognized the signs. This was prophetic utterance, the same phenomenon that had marked the judges, the prophets, the great voices that had spoken divine truth into crucial moments throughout their history. Jahaziel's face had changed. His normal expression was replaced by an intensity, a focus that suggested he was seeing and hearing something beyond the physical realm. He reached the front of the assembly and turned to face the crowd. His voice, when he spoke, was loud and clear, carrying across the courtyard with unusual power. "Listen, King Jehoshaphat and all who live in Judah and Jerusalem. This is what the Lord says to you." The crowd leaned forward. "This is what the Lord says. Not I think, not perhaps, not in my opinion. This is what the Lord says. Direct communication, divine revelation, the answer they had been waiting for. Do not be afraid or discouraged because of this vast army. Do not be afraid." The first words, not here is a complex military strategy, not call on your allies, not prepare for a long siege. Do not be afraid, for the battle is not yours, but God's. The battle is not yours. Every military leader in the crowd knew what that meant. They were being told to stand down, to set aside their training, their weapons, their carefully planned defensive positions. The battle is not yours. You're not the primary actors in this conflict, but God's. This is about something larger than national survival. This is about divine reputation. This is about God's covenant faithfulness being put on display before watching nations. The enemy might think they are marching against Judah, but they have actually picked a fight with something far beyond their comprehension. Jahaziel continued, and now his voice took on additional urgency, because he was giving specific instructions. Tomorrow march down against them. They will be climbing up by the pass of Ziz, and you will find them at the end of the gorge in the desert of Jeruel. Specific geographic locations. This was not vague spiritual encouragement. This was actionable intelligence. The pass of Ziz was a known route through the wilderness. The desert of Jeruel was a specific area. The prophecy included practical details because faith was not divorced from reality. Trust in divine intervention did not mean ignoring geography and terrain. You will not have to fight this battle. The core message, repeated for emphasis. You will not have to fight. Not you will fight and be victorious. Not you will fight and I will help you. You will not have to fight. Take up your positions. Stand firm and see the deliverance the Lord will give you, Judah and Jerusalem. Take up your positions. So they were to march out. They were to deploy as if for battle. This was not passive waiting in the city. Stand firm. Military language. Hold your ground. But see the deliverance. You are spectators in this battle. Witnesses, not warriors. Jahaziel's voice rose to a crescendo, repeating the opening command. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged. Go out to face them tomorrow, and the Lord will be with you. Then the prophetic mantle lifted. Jahaziel staggered slightly, as if released from a force that had been holding him upright. Others reached out to steady him. He looked around, seeming momentarily disoriented, as if waking from a deep sleep. But the words remained, hanging in the air, reverberating in the minds and hearts of everyone who had heard them. Jehoshaphat, still standing before the altar, slowly lowered himself to his knees. Then he bent forward until his face touched the ground, a position of complete humility, complete submission. The king of Judah, prostrate in the dirt, before God and before the assembled nation. And the people followed. Like a wave spreading across the courtyard, people dropped to their knees, then fell forward, faces to the ground. Thousands upon thousands, an entire nation in worship, responding not with skepticism or doubt, but with gratitude and trust. Then something remarkable happened. The Levites, the temple musicians, the singers, those whose normal role was to lead worship during festivals and ceremonies, began to stand. They moved to the front, forming spontaneous choirs, and they began to sing. Not somber songs of pleading, not desperate cries for mercy. They sang songs of praise, songs of thanksgiving, songs celebrating victory that had not yet happened, deliverance that existed only as a promise. Their voices rose strong and confident, filling the temple courts, spilling out into the streets, carrying across the city walls into the surrounding countryside. The time for prayer was over. The time for fasting was complete. Now was the time for worship, because they had received their answer. And the answer was not a strategy. The answer was a promise. Tomorrow they would march to war. But they would not be marching as warriors preparing for combat. They would be marching as worshippers, preparing to witness a miracle. Chapter 6. Worship before warfare. Morning came too quickly and not quickly enough. The people had spent the night in restless anticipation, some trying to sleep, others too filled with nervous energy to rest. Families held each other, unsure what the next day would bring, but choosing to trust the prophetic word they had received. As dawn light touched the eastern hills, the army began to assemble. But this was not a normal military mobilization. The usual protocols were being violated, the standard formations abandoned, because the instructions they had received were anything but standard. Jehoshaphat stood before his assembled forces. Behind him, the palace. Before him, thousands of men in various stages of military readiness. Some wore full armour, others carried only simple weapons. All watched their king, waiting for orders. We march to the desert of Jeruel, Jehoshaphat announced. His voice was steady, calm. We march in faith, trusting not in our own strength but in the God who has promised deliverance. Then he gave an order that caused visible confusion among the assembled troops. The singers go first. Silence. The soldiers looked at each other, certain they had misheard. The singers? In battle formation, the best troops led. The most experienced, heavily armoured warriors took point position. They absorbed the initial enemy contact, held the line while the rest of the force deployed. That was fundamental military doctrine, unchanged for centuries. But Jehoshaphat was not finished. Those appointed to sing to the Lord and to praise him for the splendour of his holiness will go out at the head of the army. The Levites, the temple musicians, those who normally stood in protected positions during any conflict, were being told to march in front, where casualties were highest. where the danger was greatest. They were being told to lead with worship. One of the military commanders stepped forward, choosing his words carefully. "My lord, if the enemy engages us, the singers will be the first to fall. They are not trained for combat. They do not wear armour. If we encounter the coalition forces, they will be slaughtered before the soldiers can even deploy." Jehoshaphat turned to face the commander. His expression was not angry, but it was firm. "The battle is not ours. Those are not my words. Those are the Lord's words, spoken through Jahaziel. We were told to take up positions and stand firm. We were told we would not have to fight, so we will do exactly what we were instructed to do." He turned back to the Levites, to the singers who now stood at the front of the assembly, many looking distinctly uncomfortable with their new position. "Sing," the king commanded. "Give praise to the Lord, for his love endures forever." The singers exchanged glances. This was insane. They were marching toward an army that outnumbered them several times over, and they were supposed to sing. Not war chants, not battle cries designed to intimidate the enemy and build courage in their own ranks, but worship songs. But Jehoshaphat had given an order, and he was their king. Hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence they began. "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever." The ancient refrain sung at festivals, at celebrations, at moments of thanksgiving, but never at the start of a military campaign, never marching toward battle. "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever." Other voices joined in. Soldiers began singing along. The words were familiar, burned into their memories from childhood, from countless religious observances. The melody was simple, repetitive, easy to maintain even while marching. "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever." The formation began to move. The singers at the front, their voices carrying across the early morning air. Behind them, the soldiers, still armed, still ready for combat, but singing. Behind them, support personnel, supplies, medical attendants, and scattered throughout more singers, more musicians, keeping the song going, preventing it from fading. They marched east, toward the wilderness, toward the approaching enemy, toward what every military strategist would have called certain defeat. But they marched singing. The sun climbed higher. The terrain grew rougher as they left the cultivated lands around Jerusalem and entered the rocky wilderness. The pass of Ziz, as Jahaziel had prophesied, lay ahead. Scouts reported no contact with enemy forces. The coalition army was apparently still advancing, confident, taking their time because they believed Judah was trapped. The singing continued, hour after hour. When the Levites grew tired, soldiers picked up the melody. When one group's voices grew hoarse, another section of the formation took over. The song never stopped. "Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever." Some soldiers wept as they marched and sang, not from fear, though certainly fear was present, but from something else, a strange sense of rightness, of being exactly where they were supposed to be, doing exactly what they were supposed to do, even though everything about it contradicted common sense. They were worshipping their way into battle, praising their way toward an enemy who intended to destroy them. And somehow, impossibly, it felt like the only appropriate response. The column stretched for miles now, a river of humanity flowing through the wilderness, and the sound of their singing echoed off the rocky cliffs, amplified by the terrain, carrying for incredible distances. Somewhere ahead, the enemy would hear them coming. And what would they think? An army that announced its approach with hymns, soldiers who sang about love and faithfulness rather than strength and conquest. The coalition commanders would likely view it as further evidence of Judah's weakness. Psychological warfare perhaps, but ultimately futile. You could not win battles with songs. But Judah was not trying to win a battle. They were making space for God to do what only God could do. And what happened next would become legend, told and retold for generations, a story so extraordinary that many would struggle to believe it, except that it was witnessed by thousands and changed the course of nations. Chapter 7. The Battle That Fought Itself. The terrain changed as Judah's forces approached the desert of Jeruel. The path narrowed, forcing the formation to compress. Rocky outcroppings rose on either side. It was perfect ambush territory, the kind of ground where a smaller force could inflict devastating casualties on a larger one. The scouts had gone ahead, cautious, expecting at any moment to encounter enemy forward elements. They climbed ridges, checked valleys, searched for signs of the coalition army that intelligence suggested should be nearby. Then one scout returned, riding hard, his face not showing fear but confusion. He approached the king's position, slid from his horse, knelt briefly, then stood, struggling to find words for what he had seen. "My lord, the enemy." "Speak," Jehoshaphat commanded. The singing had paused, the entire formation waiting for the scout's report. "They are destroyed, my lord. The valley ahead. There are bodies everywhere, but not our people, them, the coalition. They appear to have killed each other." Silence. Then murmuring rippled through the ranks. "Killed each other? How? Why?" "You're certain?" the king asked. "My lord, I went to the ridge overlooking the valley. I saw the camps, the banners, Moabite, Ammonite, men from Seir, all mixed together, and all dead or dying. There is no organized force remaining. Whatever happened, it was catastrophic." Jehoshaphat closed his eyes briefly, and those near him saw his lips moving in silent prayer. Then he opened his eyes and gave the order. "We advance, carefully. Prepare for possible survivors or ambush. But we go forward." The formation moved again, now with heightened alertness. Soldiers gripped weapons, scanning the terrain. Officers barked orders, maintaining discipline, preventing the ranks from breaking into a disorganized rush. They rounded a bend, and the valley of Jeruel opened before them. What they saw defied comprehension. The valley floor was carpeted with bodies, thousands upon thousands, equipment scattered everywhere, tents collapsed, campfires burned down to ash, weapons lying unused beside those who would never wield them again. It was the aftermath of a battle, but it had not been Judah's battle. The Judean forces spread out cautiously, moving through the scene, trying to understand what had happened. The evidence told a story, fragmentary but clear enough. The coalition had made camp here, confident, preparing for the final push toward Jerusalem. Then something had gone wrong. Terribly, catastrophically wrong. Perhaps it started with a misunderstanding in the dark. Different languages, different tribal markings. The Moabites, Ammonites, and peoples from Mount Seir were allies of convenience, not unified by language or culture. Bound together by a common enemy, but lacking the deep trust that comes from long alliance. In the darkness, perhaps a Moabite patrol encountered Ammonite sentries. Neither side recognized the other immediately. Someone panicked. A weapon was drawn, blood was shed. The fighting spread. Units hearing combat in the night assumed they were under attack. They grabbed weapons, rallied to defend their section of camp, and in the confusion they attacked whoever was nearest. Once started, the violence became self-perpetuating. Old grudges surfaced. Ancient rivalries between tribes that had been temporarily suppressed for the campaign now erupted. The unified coalition dissolved into chaos, each group fighting for survival against everyone else. By morning, the army that had seemed invincible had destroyed itself. Some Judean soldiers simply stood, staring, unable to process the scene. Others wept, overwhelmed by relief and awe. This was the deliverance they had been promised. This was the battle they did not have to fight. Jehoshaphat walked through the valley, his personal guard surrounding him, surveying the destruction. He paused occasionally, looking at abandoned banners, at siege equipment that would never be used, at supply wagons full of provisions that had been meant to sustain an occupation of Judah. "The battle is not yours, but God's," the king whispered, repeating Jahaziel's prophetic word. "You will not have to fight this battle." It had been literal truth, not metaphor, not spiritual encouragement, actual physical reality. They had not fought, They had marched, singing, and arrived to find their enemies already defeated by forces beyond human comprehension or control. The commanders began organising collection teams. The prophetic word had said they would see deliverance. It had not mentioned what would come after. But ancient customs of warfare were clear. The victor claimed the spoils, and spread across this valley were the supplies, weapons, equipment, and valuables of 3 armies. Gather everything, Jehoshaphat ordered, clothes, equipment, valuables, all of it, but take nothing that is forbidden, no idols, no objects of pagan worship. We will take what can be sanctified and used, and we will destroy the rest. The collection began. It would take days. The amount of material was staggering. Armour and weapons, yes, but also gold and silver, precious stones, fine fabrics. The coalition armies had been confident enough to bring their wealth with them, perhaps anticipating a long occupation, perhaps planning to use it to hire additional mercenaries after Judah fell. Now it would go to Judah instead, not as conquest taken through violence, but as provision given through divine intervention. The soldiers worked systematically, gathering materials, sorting, organising. The mood was subdued despite the magnitude of the victory. There was joy, yes, but also a kind of sacred awe. They were walking through a demonstration of power that made human military might seem trivial by comparison. As the first day of collection ended and the Judean forces made camp in the valley, Jehoshaphat called his commanders together. Tomorrow we continue the collection. It will take at least 3 days, perhaps 4. When we're finished, we return to Jerusalem. But we do not return as conquering warriors. We return as witnesses. What happened here will be told to our children and our children's children. This valley will be remembered. One of the commanders spoke up. My lord, what should we call this place? It needs a name that captures what happened here. Jehoshaphat looked around the valley, at the camps of his people, at the evidence of destruction that had not come by their hand, at the lavish provision that had come from the enemy's own supplies. We will call it the Valley of Berekah, he said quietly, the Valley of Blessing. Because that was what it was, not a battlefield in the traditional sense, a place where curse had been transformed into blessing, where intended destruction had become unexpected provision, where human impossibility had encountered divine faithfulness and found that faith was stronger than fear, stronger than armies, stronger than any coalition of human power, the Valley of Blessing. The name would stick, lasting for centuries, a permanent memorial to the day when worship won a battle that swords could never have won. Chapter 8. The Valley of Blessing. For 3 full days Judah remained in the valley. The collection of spoils continued from sunrise to sunset, requiring careful organisation to manage the enormous quantity of materials. The armour alone represented wealth beyond calculation. Bronze helmets, chest plates, shin guards, shields, all sized for warriors, but the metal could be melted down and reforged for Judah's own forces or sold to traders. The weapons were of exceptional quality. The coalition had clearly spared no expense in equipping their troops, confident that superior numbers and better equipment would guarantee victory. Then there were the supplies: grain, oil, wine, dried meat, enough to feed Judah's entire army for months. Tents, cooking equipment, water containers, everything needed to sustain a military campaign, medical supplies, tools, rope, pack animals, donkeys and camels, wandering loose through the valley, now rounded up and claimed. But the most stunning discoveries were the valuables: gold and silver in astonishing quantities, precious stones, fine clothing, musical instruments. Apparently some of the coalition forces had brought their family wealth with them, either because they expected to be gone for an extended period, or because they planned to settle in Judah after conquering it. The Levites oversaw the collection, ensuring that forbidden items were identified and destroyed rather than taken. Idols, ritual objects associated with pagan worship, anything that might bring spiritual corruption into Judah. These were gathered separately and burned. The soldiers worked with an interesting mixture of efficiency and reverence. This was not looting in the traditional sense. This was harvesting a field they had not planted, gathering fruit from trees they had not cultivated. They worked diligently, but without the frenzy or greed that often accompanied battlefield plunder. Each evening, as the sun set, the camp gathered for worship. The Levites led, but increasingly everyone participated. They sang the same songs they had sung on the march, but now with different emotional resonance. Then it had been faith without evidence. Now it was thanksgiving based on witnessed reality. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. The words carried across the valley, a counterpoint to the silence of death that had defined this place days before. Where confusion and violence had reigned, now there was order and peace. Where enemies had destroyed themselves, now allies worked together, building community even in the process of collecting the remains of war. Jehoshaphat spent time each day walking through the site, often alone except for a single guard. He studied the scene, fixing it in his memory. He understood that he had witnessed something few kings ever saw, a clear, unmistakable demonstration that divine power was real and could act decisively in human affairs. This was not a battle won through superior tactics or a fortuitous alliance or even exceptional courage by his troops. This was intervention, pure and simple. Judah had shown up and watched God fight their battle for them. On the third evening, the king called a special assembly. The entire camp gathered, and he stood before them, his voice carrying in the still air. "We came to this valley expecting to fight," he began. "We came prepared to die if necessary. We came trusting a promise that seemed impossible, and we found that faith in God's word is never misplaced." He paused, looking around at the faces in the crowd, soldiers who had feared they would never see their families again, young men who had been prepared to give their lives in defense of their nation, old veterans who had seen battle before and knew how rarely conflicts ended with 0 friendly casualties. "Tomorrow we begin the journey home. We will return to Jerusalem carrying more than we could have imagined. But the true treasure is not the gold or silver. It is the knowledge that the God we serve is faithful, that when we do not know what to do but our eyes are on him, he acts." The crowd murmured agreement. Then someone began to sing, and others joined in, and soon the entire assembly was engaged in spontaneous worship. Not because it was scheduled or required, but because the only appropriate response to what they had experienced was gratitude. That night, lying in his tent, Jehoshaphat thought about the political implications. Word would spread. Other nations would hear what happened. How would they respond? With fear, certainly. With caution. Small kingdoms survived by being either powerful enough to deter attack or too insignificant to be worth conquering. Judah had just demonstrated a third option. Protection that came not from military strength or political irrelevance, but from divine favour. The surrounding nations would think twice before attacking. Not because they feared Judah's army, but because they would wonder if Judah's God would fight on their behalf again. Chapter 9. Peace restored. The return to Jerusalem was unlike any military homecoming in memory. Usually armies returned either in grim silence after defeat, or in boisterous celebration after hard-won victory. This was neither. The column moved slowly, burdened with the enormous quantity of spoils. Pack animals, carts, soldiers carrying bundles. Behind them the Valley of Blessing already becoming a landmark, a place that would be pointed out to travellers for generations. As they approached Jerusalem, lookouts spotted them and raced ahead to spread the news. The army was returning, and they were intact, no evidence of casualties, and loaded with plunder. The city gates opened, and the people poured out to meet them. The scene was chaotic with joy. Families reunited, children ran to their fathers, wives embraced husbands they had feared they would never see again. But beneath the celebration was something deeper. As the story spread, told by soldiers to their families, shared in the streets, repeated in the markets, the people began to understand what had actually happened. This was not a normal military victory. This was not even an extraordinary military victory. This was something else entirely. God had fought for them. literally, physically, decisively, while they watched. The procession continued through the city streets toward the temple. Jehoshaphat led, but the focus was not on the king. This was not a royal triumph. This was a national thanksgiving. At the temple, the priests were ready. The king had sent word ahead, and preparations had been made for proper sacrifices of thanksgiving. The altars burned continuously for days as the nation brought offerings, not as obligation, but as overflow of gratitude. Jehoshaphat stood before the people again, this time in the temple courts where just days before he had confessed their helplessness. "We asked the Lord what to do," he said. "We confessed we had no power to face the vast army attacking us. We admitted we did not know what to do, but our eyes were on him." The crowd listened, many of them having been present for that original prayer, and he answered, not with a complex strategy, not with a demand for greater faith. He answered with a simple command: "Do not be afraid. The battle is not yours. You will not have to fight. Go out tomorrow and see what I will do." Jehoshaphat's voice grew stronger. "We obeyed. We went out. We took the singers with us, worshipping our way toward what should have been our destruction. And we found our enemies had destroyed themselves. We collected spoils for 3 days. We renamed the valley Blessing because that is what it became." He paused, then his voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but in the silence of the crowd's attention, everyone heard. "Remember this. When fear comes, when circumstances overwhelm, when the odds are impossible, remember that the battle is not ours. Remember that our God fights for those who trust him." The days that followed were unlike anything Jerusalem had experienced. It was celebration, yes, but also deep national reflection. The event had been too dramatic, too clear, to be brushed aside or explained away. Even the most sceptical, those who tended toward practical politics and military realism, could not deny what had happened. And the impact rippled outward. Traders carried the story to other cities. Travellers heard it and shared it in distant regions. The news spread across the ancient Near East. Judah's enemies had destroyed themselves. Judah's God had fought their battle for them. The response from surrounding nations was immediate and dramatic. Kings who had been considering military action against Judah reconsidered. Tribute that had been slow in coming arrived promptly. Alliances that had been conditional became more concrete. The text from that period is direct. The fear of God came on all the surrounding kingdoms when they heard how the Lord had fought against the enemies of Israel, and the kingdom of Jehoshaphat was at peace, for his God had given him rest on every side, peace, not negotiated through treaties or maintained through military deterrence, peace that came because potential adversaries decided that attacking Judah was simply too dangerous, not because of Judah's strength, but because of their God's demonstrated willingness to intervene. For years afterward, Judah experienced stability. Trade flourished. The population grew. The reforms Jehoshaphat had instituted took deeper root. The teaching of the law continued. Justice was administered fairly. The temple remained the centre of national life. But what persisted most strongly was the memory. Parents told their children. Teachers incorporated the story into instruction. Singers composed songs about it. The Valley of Blessing became a pilgrimage site, a place where people would go to remember, to give thanks, to strengthen their own faith by standing where the impossible had happened. Because that was ultimately what the story was about, not military strategy, not political manoeuvring, not human cleverness or strength. It was about what happened when a nation faced impossible odds, confessed their helplessness, trusted a promise that seemed absurd, and discovered that faith was not weakness, but the doorway to power beyond human comprehension. Epilogue. Victory through trust. Years later, long after the events at the Valley of Blessing, an elderly Jehoshaphat would reflect on his reign. He had faced many challenges. He had made mistakes, as all leaders do. He had navigated complex political situations, managed internal conflicts, dealt with the endless complications of governing a small nation surrounded by larger powers. But when asked about the defining moment of his kingship, he always returned to that valley, to the day when singing replaced strategy, when worship won a battle that weapons never could have. The lesson was not that military strength was irrelevant. Judah maintained its army, kept its fortifications, continued to train soldiers, but the people never forgot that their ultimate security came not from chariots or cavalry, but from covenant relationship with a God who was faithful to his promises. That knowledge changed how they faced subsequent challenges, not with false confidence or presumption, but with a deep-rooted trust that when they did what they could, and then looked to God for the rest, he would be faithful. The story spread far beyond Judah's borders. It became part of the cultural memory not just of one nation, but of many. Centuries later, people who had never heard of Jehoshaphat, who could not have pointed to the Valley of Blessing on a map, still told stories about the time an army was defeated by singing. Because it touched something universal in human experience, the feeling of being overwhelmed, of facing odds that seem insurmountable, of reaching the end of your own strength and resources and having nowhere else to turn. In those moments, the story of Jehoshaphat whispered a possibility. Maybe the battle is not yours. Maybe your inadequacy is not the end of the story. Maybe there is power available to those who are willing to admit their weakness and trust something greater than themselves. Not every crisis ends like the Valley of Blessing. Not every prayer receives such a dramatic answer. The world is complex, and faith does not eliminate suffering or guarantee earthly success. But the story remains, preserved across millennia, because it witnessed a truth that remains true. When fear surrounds us, trust can become our greatest defense. When we face enemies too strong for us to defeat, worship can be an act of warfare. When we do not know what to do, fixing our eyes on divine faithfulness is not naive optimism, but profound wisdom. The coalition army approached the Valley of Jeruel with overwhelming force, confident in their numbers, certain of victory. They had planned for every military contingency. They had brought sufficient supplies. They had coordinated between multiple nations. What they had not planned for was the possibility that their target was protected by something beyond military calculation. That Judah's confession of weakness would become a doorway to strength. That songs of praise would prove more powerful than swords. The sun sets now over what was once called the Valley of Blessing. The ancient battles are long finished. The kingdoms that fought them have crumbled into dust. The soldiers who witnessed the impossible have been gone for centuries. But the lesson remains, passed down through generations, preserved in text and memory, and the lived experience of countless individuals who have faced their own impossible battles. Sometimes the greatest victories come not through fighting, but through faith. Not through strength, but through surrender. Not through knowing what to do, but through admitting you do not know, and turning your eyes toward the one who does. The battle is not always yours. Sometimes you're called simply to take your position, stand firm, worship, and watch what God will do. And when fear surrounds you, when the odds are overwhelming, when you have exhausted your own resources and strategies, remember a small nation that faced a vast army with singing. Remember a king who confessed helplessness and found power. Remember a valley where intended destruction became unexpected blessing. Remember that trust can be a weapon more powerful than any forged from bronze or iron. That faith is not weakness, but the doorway to strength beyond human comprehension. Remember and take courage. The battle may not be yours at all,